focused on make money at any cost. And I think they forget about the long term, the life of a company and keeping it alive and making it into something, making it last as opposed to just meeting the last quarterly statement and also doing what's right. My God, just be a human being. Is it so hard?
Well said. I think I read a very good book by Daniel Pink this year titled When. And so much of what I read in the personal growth category over the years, John, focuses more on the how-to, how to win friends and influence people, how to think and grow rich, that sort of teaching these books do for you. When is a little bit about the science behind our internal clocks on when to do things during the day, during the calendar. Some of it depends on your personality type, but it was a really fascinating read and kind of a different take on being efficient and trying to have personal growth. And it's helped me work-wise in terms of my team and I, like when I tackle tasks and when I have difficult conversations. That's been really helpful. So that's When by Daniel Pink. You familiar with that one at all?
No, that sounds like a fun one. I'm writing these down. Have you read anything by Nassim Taleb? He's the one who did Black Swan and Skin in the Game.
Yes.
And, I mean, that's so dense. It counts as triple the thickness for reading because you got to go reread.
Oh, my God.
And so I haven't finished it yet. I'm working my way through Skin in the Game. And, of course, I love how irreverent he is. And he pisses off all the right people, which especially academics who just deserve to be angry.
He's so incredibly brilliant, but also irreverent. And yeah, I read The Black Swan years ago, and it was such a tough read because he's so smart. It's so much work just to keep up, at least for me, to keep up with him. So I'll have to check that out, Skin in the Game.
Are you familiar with go ahead, your turn.
No, I was going to say my favorite author came out with a book late this year, Malcolm Gladwell, which I read, Talking to Strangers. Are you a Malcolm Gladwell fan?
I've read some of his stuff. I don't care for his politics and how he tries to nudge you in that direction. Other than that, I think he's brilliant. Really, it's a lot like, who's the guy who wrote Money Game and several other books like that?
Michael Lewis.
Similarly. He's a brilliant man and a brilliant writer, but he's just openly political.
Well, you know what? A lot of his books were less so, but lately he's become more of a political figure, including his most recent book. I read an excerpt of it, but too political from me with Michael Lewis. But, you know, he wrote The Blind Side, Moneyball, Liar's Poker, The Big Short, which I think is a definitive book on the financial crisis, brilliantly written.
Well, no, you know what? The Big Short is 1/3 absolutely right. When he talks about Wall Street's role and what they did, it's compelling.
Yes.
But he pretends government had nothing to do with it. So you got to read John Allison. John Allison, who was CEO of, I think it was BB&T. He wrote a great book on how the government caused the crash. It was the rule, the banks and brokerage houses and so on followed the rules that the government set. And those rules, everyone has talked about in school for a long time about encouraging bad behavior, about rewarding, or privatizing profit, socializing loss, which is exactly what they did. Moral hazard is the dry term we used to use back in school in economics to describe all that. And I think it really came home to roost. And then I don't know if anyone's written about the other third of the component, which is the normal American. What happened to personal responsibility? What happened to personal responsibility? And, you have a responsibility to pay your loan, which now with Bernie out there screaming, you don't have to pay your loans. Warren, I mean, and this is the precursor to it of, you borrowed the money, you have to pay it back, and shouldn't you decide and look and think about, can I actually pay this? And I think that's what Lewis missed. And so while I like him, and while I really like Gladwell, I think he sometimes a little more subtly engages in similar things. So I love it, both for the language and the content, but I do read it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I I would assign more of that to Michael Lewis, especially now, than Malcolm Gladwell. But I see what you're saying. And before I brought up Talking to Strangers, you were going to mention something. Do you recall what it was?
That must have been it. There were some other books that, let me see here, I have my list. So I'll tell you who I gained a lot of respect for. I read his book, and I couldn't stop. I blew through it like crazy. Senator Ben Sasse wrote 2 books. The first one was The Vanishing American Adult. Brilliant. I mean, he talks about how to raise kids, his experience raising kids, what is changing, and it's not quite, I'm not going to give it away, it's not quite what you would think it would be. That man's education is unbelievable. I mean, the fact that he's a conservative after getting a doctorate in history, I think it was Yale, and you can tell he knows history. He really understands and knows history and learns from it, because that's the point. You know, people have not changed. Tech has, but people have not. And so that book was really brilliant in terms of how did we used to bring up kids and what has been changing and is changing even more dramatically. It was brilliant. And then he put another book called Them, and it's about the increasing polarization and us versus them. And he turned me on to some notions that I wasn't thinking about at the time in terms of the effect of social media, in terms of how you think and what it's missing and what it has and how it caters to some of our most base instincts. And I think we have a sense of that. But again, he really got into just the lack of human connection and what we're substituting for it. He's a brilliant man. I really like him. Now, it helps that I really like his politics as well. But he's more like a Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose politics I did not like, but whose intellect and intellectual honesty I did like.
Sure. That surprises me. I wouldn't think that you necessarily would hold Ben Sasse politically in high regard. He's often described as a rhino, Republican in name only type politician. And I don't know, if I was betting, not that I would bet over this, I would think that you wouldn't be such a fan of his. So that surprises me a bit.
He's a true conservative. I think what he has done is he doesn't like Trump, and he views Trump as a populist and a horrible personal example for everyone's kids. And so he kind of quietly lets some things happen, but there are times when Trump creates precedents that are going to be with us for a very long time that is a matter of principle he disagrees with. And so while I support Trump in the sense of, well, good Lord, have you seen what the alternative is?
Right.
There are precedents, I think far more by the Democrats, that have been fed right back to them. Like this impeachment thing means everybody gets impeached from now on. This is crazy. And they create precedents, or when you get rid of the filibuster, just a procedural thing that's huge, and now they're paying for it with judge selection. And so I think Sasse is extremely principled. Now, I might disagree with him sometimes, because in politics you always have to have a balance between principle and practical, what works. And if you go too far in either direction, there are problems with it. And sometimes it may not be possible to reconcile the two. Would you like to lose as a gentleman, or would you like to win as a thug? Man, that's not a friendly, happy choice to make.
No, and that seems to be a big question in our body politic today. So I'm going to check out Ben Sasse's books. What other books come to mind that you want to bring up to me as well as the people that are listening? But let's be honest, this episode's more about me getting book ideas for 2020.
Let me look here. So 2 of my favorite political writers, Kevin Williamson writes for National Review as a columnist. He's a libertarian amongst conservatives, but he's something I don't normally put in the same sentence. He's a practical libertarian, because most of them are like communists. They're so pie-in-the-sky theory, and so they have such a hard time with truly human nature and reality. And this guy really he really understands humans. So his writing, it's called a book called The Smallest Minority. So he's like, yeah, I'm all about minority rights. My definition of minority, the smallest minority, is a minority of one, the individual. Right. And it's a very good, it's not a happy book. He does not like democracy or does not like the unwashed masses. I believe he describes them frequently as Twitter-bound feces-flinging rage monkeys.
All right. Even though it's not a happy book, I will check.
It is hilarious. I mean, he is a good writer. And Jonah Goldberg is a brilliant writer for National Review, more of a classic conservative. And he wrote a book called, where did I put it here? The Suicide of the West. So as you can imagine, it's not happy. But let me tell you what, the first, 200 pages, in order to talk to you about what the West is, he talks about the miracle, capital T, capital M. And that is such a good way to describe it. We think it's normal. We live in it. Our society is a miracle. It's so rare in history what we have. And what we're becoming is much more common. But he describes the prosperity it's created, the wellness, the good living, the health, you name it. And what caused that? What created it? And so just that description, and then he kind of goes in a similar direction to Williamson, but here's what we're doing with it, and here's what we need to do to try and preserve it. So he's not a fan of populism, Trump's included, but very, very thoughtful writer when it comes to why our society was, I don't know that it still is, but was truly exceptional and frankly superior.
Very good. You mentioned this early on, John, when we were talking that I think you referred to the Dreadnought book. Did I pronounce that right? Mm-hmm. That you reread it every few years. Are there books that you regularly reread because they're so important to you?
There's one called, and there are several under the name, I think this one was written in the early 90s, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. And this guy goes into Europe and technology back when he starts with, look, China and the Islamic Empire was way ahead of us on scholarship and gunpowder and paper and everything else. And why did Europe surpass them? Called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. I read that about every 7 years. Of course, Atlas Shrugged I read about every 5.
Did you like the movie adaptation?
Oh, my God, no. They tried. The problem is this. What Ayn Rand expresses is much better expressed in writing than on screen. One of Ayn Rand's problems, for all that I love her logic and her understanding of economics, like the communists, she thinks economics are everything, and there's way more to people than that. In fact, she tried to implement some of her ideas in person, and she was personally just a miserable, unhappy, messed up person. And I think it shows in those characters that you can't just be striding purposefully everywhere and be creating wealth. That's important, but there really is more to it.
Very good. So you do have a wide range of things that you read. How do you keep track? Do you keep track of what you read someplace, like I do in Goodreads? It's a very popular app.
I need to get into that. Here's what I have memory for bits and pieces. If you ask me what I learned from a book, big picture, I can tell you. If you ask me about the details, they're gone. I read so much, I just can't retain it all. What triggered me was the move to Puerto Rico. My wife made me get rid of 20% of my books, which was 1,000 books. And
oh, my goodness.
I have 4,000 books showing up on a container sometime. I don't know exactly when, it being Puerto Rico and all. And so going through triggered some things that I wanted to reread. I just reread, it's a rather dry one. I'd have to find the author, but it's called The German Army, 1939 to 1945. My grandmother bought it for me back in high school. I think I was a freshman, and I love it. He's so contrary. He talks about Liddell-Hart and Fuller and their theories of armored warfare, and why the Germans really didn't implement it, and why their strategy was really just more classical German encirclement, kind of like the Battle of Cannae in Rome, which is what the Germans modeled themselves on. And they didn't really actually understand armored warfare, except for maybe Guderian and a few of them who were silenced. And they also got into their relationship with Hitler and how Hitler ended up totally bringing them to heel and dominating them. It's just an extremely well-written book. I think I only read that one about every 10 years, but when we were moving, I saw it in there in the stack, and I just yanked it out and took that with me.
So it made the cut?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's pretty